Over the next week, we're going to be putting together multiple potent builds for all classes that we believe are going to dominate in this next sandbox. However, for my beloved Titans, I just wanted to give you guys a little sneak peek of what I believe is going to be among the best builds we'll get to play in Edge of Fate. Now, if there is one thing we could say positive about Edge of Fate, it's that this sandbox overhaul, these systematic changes, from difficulty to damage squishing to our transfer of stats, the ability to build up to 200, fellas, I cannot stress just how much Destiny is about to change for us. Now, to kick things off, we're going to start with this first video featuring Titan builds, which takes us to a build that I know many of you are familiar with. And this particular build is receiving a major buff in the Edge of Fate, and that's our Solar Ignition based build utilizing Path of Burning Steps and Polaris Lance. Now, the last time we used this build was Season of the Wish. And you remember back then, guys, you could just sit in the back, pepper enemies, and it was non-stop kabloomies. Now, starting with our exotic, Path of Burning Steps. This is being reworked to increase solar weapon and ignition damage based on the number of stacks of Roaring Flames that you have. With Roaring Flames equipped, at ×1, it will grant us a 10% weapon damage buff. ×2, it will grant us 15%, and ×3 will cap out at 20%. Now, not only does this buff our weapon damage itself, but it also buffs our ignition damage. ×1 is 5%, ×2 is 10%, and ×3 is 15%. Now, this is in addition to the buff Roaring Flames already provides our abilities. Now, keep in mind, before its last rework, Path of Burning Steps was receiving weapon surge stacks, but this version will now receive its own damage buff alongside Roaring Flames. What this means is that you can stack weapon damage buffs with surge mods. Now, there's also some other benefits about Path of Burning Steps. It reduces the duration of suspend, slow, and freeze effects that are applied to you, something that may become useful on the Kepler destination. But another rework was to Roaring Flames directly. Its melee damage buff is being increased from 73 to now 200% in response to the additive damage stacking changes. Now, we made an entire video going over all the melee changes, but Throwing Hammer is definitely back on the menu, as its eternal cooldown seems to be completely pulled back, allowing for easy ability kills on minors and a few elites. And not only do we get buffs for our melee with Roaring Flames, but we also get increased grenade and super damage, that being 20% at 1 stack, 44% at 2 stacks, and 73% at 3 stacks. TLDR on this one, guys, Path of Burning Steps is looking a lot better. Now, this takes us to Polaris Lance. Polaris Lance has an exotic perk called Perfect Fifth, which states that precision hits return ammo to the magazine. Landing for precision hits loads a delayed solar explosive that scorches targets for your next shot. I cannot stress just how good this perk is. You can legitimately shoot Polaris Lance for an eternity without reloading, as long as you can land crits. And every 5th crit is going to shoot a round that sticks to whatever it hits and explodes, and will therefore spread scorch to surrounding targets, producing even more explosions if those scorch stacks ignite. Now, when you added Path of Burning Steps, that's going to increase that ignition damage, along with just boosting Polaris outright. Now, in addition to Roaring Flames, we're also going to go with Sol Invictus as our other aspect, as it peppers the battlefield with sunspots. This aspect says that solar ability kills, scorched enemy kills, and Hammer of Soul impacts create a sunspot. Now, standing in a sunspot refreshes its duration to a max of 12 seconds and grants Sol Invictus for 5 seconds, which provides us ×1 in restoration and grants 100% additional grenade and melee regeneration and a 40% passive super drain, allowing you to stay in your Hammer of Soul for even longer. Now, that all sounds great and all, but the main reason why we're using this is that as you are shooting with Polaris Lance, you are going to be lighting the battlefield up with scorch, ignitions, and at the same time dropping sunspots everywhere. Again, we have seen this build pop off before, and with the artifact mods we're getting this coming season, we think this one's going to be very strong. We're going to get into that in just a moment. Now, some of you may be asking, Cross, what about some other exotic weapons? Maybe I don't want to sit in the back with a scout rifle. Fair enough. You've got Tommy's Matchbook, which is also getting a very sizable buff. That would be a good weapon to utilize with this build. And I would say for more close range encounters, definitely go Tommy's. Another one is actually 2 solar bows, one being Hierarchy of Needs, which is getting a buff, the other being TQ's Divination. Both exotic bows. Granted, TQ's doesn't necessarily synergize with Scorch itself, but it's still going to be a very good option next season with our artifact mods. And Hierarchy of Needs, not necessarily going to be a good bow by itself, but it's going to be the Gallahorn of Bows after its update goes live. Now, let's talk fragments real quick on this build. First on the list, we have Ember of Ashes. This allows for more Scorch stacks to be added to targets, leading to faster ignitions. Then we have Ember of Char, which says that ignitions apply 40 Scorch stacks, or 60 with Ember of Ashes, to enemies damaged by the explosion. Once again, this helps spread the Scorch and ignitions from Polaris. Then we have Ember of Eruption, another ignition-based fragment that says ignitions have a 20% increase blast radius. And then lastly, you can kind of pick your final fragments, but in my opinion, I would choose Ember of Solace. This says that radiant and restoration effects applied to you have increased duration. This one in particular is going to be really nice, not just in its current form, but with our artifact mods, which let's talk about those mods right now. First, we do have Anti-Barrier Scout Rifle, which is perfect here for Polaris. We also have this mod called Fever and Chill. This is going to be providing us with radiance on precision hits, which is exactly what we're going to be doing here with Polaris. Now, another mod we're getting is called Elemental Daze. It says that stunning a champion with an elemental weapon creates an elementally aligned explosion, applying a matching elemental debuff to them and nearby targets. And what this essentially translates to is even more scorch stacks. Now, to top everything off for our artifact mods, we have Radiant Shrapnel, dealing sustained weapon damage while radiance, or defeating a scorch combatant with a weapon causes the target to release solar projectiles that deal damage and scorch on impact. Do you see the gameplay loop here, guys? You've got Fever and Chill, which is just going to give us free radiance. And then you have Radiant Shrapnel, which is immediately going to pick up on that, adding even more damage to everything around it. Now, as much as I'm praising Polaris Lance here, TQ's actually looks really good with this lineup of artifact mods. Regardless though, guys, we got some heavily stacked solar artifact mods, which are going to pick up these builds even further. Now, something else I want to mention about stunning champions in the next season. Stated in a TWAB, weapons that intrinsically have the anti-champion symbol in the weapon tray cannot receive anti-champion capabilities from the artifact or from radiant-like effects. Otherwise, they can receive external anti-champion capabilities and be able to continue their subclass verb anti-champion capabilities. Now, the reason why this is so interesting for Polaris is that it can stun unstoppables. Since again, after you apply scorch stacks and you cause an ignition, that stuns them. But it doesn't have intrinsic anti-champion capabilities, or at least a symbol in its weapon tray, which means it's going to be one of the few weapons that actually does have the ability to double stun both barrier champions and unstoppable champions. We'll be taking a look at this though, guys, and I know some of you are going to point out the second part of that readout from Bungie, but my interpretation of this is that Polaris is going to have the ability to double stun even in this next sandbox. So with the artifact mods out of the way, as well as our exotic pieces, what is going to be the best armor mods? More specifically, the best archetype for this build. Let's start with the archetype. Again, archetypes is something that Bungie's introducing in this next sandbox. Think of it as a way to have definitive stat splits going forward for specific builds in mind. In this case, I would definitely say we need to focus our weapon damage. And the gunner archetype fits this very well. It'll give us higher weapon stats as our primary spike, and then we'll also receive a smaller spike in our grenade energy. Now, I'm not going to sit here and run through tier 5 armor because, again, that's like a long way from now. Ideally, we will eventually get up to tier 5. But the point is, the two stats I would definitely build into would be weapons for that increase in weapon damage on top of a grenade. And keep in mind, as we get into tier 4 and tier 5 armor, you're going to be getting a flat damage buff just from the armor itself. So that on top of the damage buff from the weapon stats. And if you're looking at triple stack even further, Surge mods stacks with Path of Burning Steps. Overall, guys, this one is looking really, really juicy. And whether you're using Polaris Lance with this build or any other combination of solar weaponry, whether that means Sunshot, TQ's Divination, Tommy's Matchbook, there's some juicy combinations here, guys, that will be extra potent in Edge of Fate. Now on to our next build. Fellas, we recently covered melees and the changes coming to pretty much all of our melees and the associated exotics that are getting buffs or even nerfs after Edge of Fate goes live. What we have found is that this particular build is seeing some of the biggest increases in melee damage. That being the combination of our exotic armor piece, Wishful Ignorance, with Fletched Storm. Now, this is personally one of my favorite exotics and also one of my favorite gameplay loops in the game. The only problem is that it just hasn't been that good. Definitely looks cool, but in terms of raw damage, it would fall behind the competition. Now, let's talk what's changing. For Fletched Storm, this is going to go from a 50% buff to a whopping 200% buff at 3 stacks. Guys, that is crazy. Even after we work through the numbers and we take away the fact that things are no longer multiplicative, these are the side-by-side numbers. And these are the numbers you're going to be putting out come Edge of Fate. Now, how the buff works is that upon scoring a Frenzy Blade or a Fletched Storm hit, you're granted stacks of Wish Dragon's Talents, which increases your damage for about 2.5 seconds and refreshes when another melee attack is landed. This is why this beautifully synergizes with Fletched Storm, as it starts off at a 10% buff, goes up to 25% at 2 stacks, and then 200% at 3 stacks. Now, not only does it grant us a damage buff to our melee, but it also grants us an entire extra melee charge. Now, if you were to use this with Frenzy Blade, this provides 4 total melees. But But for Fletched Storm, this combination of Wishful Ignorance allows you to launch a total of 7 volleys of 4 unraveling projectiles, with half a charge being spent on the initial slide proc. Now you can only get 5 at base, but each Fletched melee spends 50% of your charge, which is what allows us here to easily spam our melees, especially if you're regenerating melee energy while doing damage. Now when we combine this with Banner of War, this stacks our damage up even further, while also giving us that little bit of healing to aid us in survivability. Now if we were to look at the hypothetical calculations in Edge of Fate, again, we've broke these numbers down already, but you could see how much higher the multiplier is and the total damage is with these Fletched volleys. Guys, this is no joke. I cannot express just how much better this entire kit is going to be in this next sandbox. Guys, it's so good that in my opinion, you should use something like Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is obviously a fantastic exotic for giving you back your melee abilities, but 9 times out of 10, I would actually say it's a waste of an exotic slot. But given how good this melee damage is, Monte Carlo is definitely worth using for the ability to top off your melees. And keep in mind, as you're getting melee kills, Markov Chain is also proccing, giving your Monte Carlo the ability to deal more damage. And on top of that is an exotic, which by default does more damage anyways. Now to take this a step further, in one of the most recent TWABs, Bungie is making a catalyst change to Monte Carlo, and that its bayonet strike damage is no longer being reduced against bosses, mini bosses, and champions. So in the midst of all of this, you'll be able to use Monte Carlo in its bayonet form to tack on a little extra damage. Now in terms of artifact mods, we can take advantage of Rapid Fire Overload for Monte Carlo. You've got Flame Fiber Freeze for those easy slottable siphon mods for orbs. And for those that are unfamiliar, Flame Fiber Freeze was an artifact mod that we had in a previous season, and it combines Solar and Strand siphon mods into one single mod, along with Solar and Stasis siphon mods in another, essentially allowing us to have easier build crafting. Now another great artifact option is Refresh Threads. When we pick up the tangles that we're creating, this is going to provide our ability with the lowest charge extra energy. We've got Threaded Blast, which is something you normally utilize with a Strand weapon, but you could hit one of these tangles with your Fletched Volley, giving you some extra AoE damage. You also have Elemental Coalescence, which is a no-brainer for the extra tangles on kills. Shield Crush is also going to be another artifact mod that we 1000% want to slot in. You'll get the 25% melee regeneration rates and the 25% extra melee damage while we have Woven Mail. And this is going to be on top of the 200% damage from our ×3 Wish Dragon's talents. Now Tangle Web is another great mod if you don't decide to go with Radiant Shrapnel, which I think for these Strand builds, leaning fully into Strand is going to be the way to go. Now what Tangle Web does is that when you create a tangle, the enemies around where you just created it will become suspended. So you can see here, guys, we have a ton of artifact mods that are going to work beautifully with Wishful Ignorance and Fletched Storm. Now in terms of subclass fragments, I like Thread of Warding. It allows us to get Woven Mail when we pick up orbs, and this is great because it will assist with keeping the Shield Crush buff active, along with just giving us great damage resistance. You've got Thread of Fury, which grants us melee energy when dealing damage with a tangle. Another option is Thread of Transmutation, which says that while Woven Mail is active, weapon kills spawn a tangle. And we're gonna have to see how this synergizes with the artifact mod, as there is a base internal cooldown, but could be really good nonetheless. And we also have Thread of Isolation for severing on precision hits, which can lead to more tangle creations, as well as just less damage being dealt to you. And if you don't like that, you can do Thread of Generation for that extra melee energy when damaging enemies. Now finally, the last one I want to mention is Thread of Continuity. If you don't like those last few fragments, you could do this one, which provides our Strand debuffs with 50% more uptime, which in this case allows us to take advantage of Cauterized Darkness even longer. Now since this build is going to be so heavily focused on our powered melee, in terms of armor, I do think that the Brawler archetype is going to be the best here. This is going to give us the primary stats in our melee stats, and the secondary being in our health stats. Main takeaway for this, guys, we're going to do everything we can to get this stat up to 200. We want maximum damage. And keep in mind, that 30% increased damage when you have a 200 melee stats, that's a multiplicative bonus, not additive. Everything else is additive, but the damage buff from our stats, that's multiplicative. And let me just say, guys, this one is looking extra juicy. Now, our third and final build. I know most people are going to say, Cross, what about Stasis? We have artifact mods for Stasis. Why don't you bring that up? Well, look, there are some pretty good Stasis builds, and I can go on and on with a number of different really solid Stasis builds. Personally, I really like things like Icefall Mantle with Ager Scepter. No, it isn't as potent as it would be on Warlocks, but it's still a very good build. We'll have a dim link down below, and you can think of that as an honorable mention. This final build, though, is one that Kujay cooked up himself. And let me just say, guys, this may be one of the strongest builds I have ever played with. That being the combination of Choir 1 and Actium War rig. Now, let me just say, obviously, Actium War rig with machine guns and auto rifles is very good because it auto reloads them. But the difference is that it's getting a massive update in Edge of Fate. You see, auto rifle and machine gun final blows will increase their stability, their ammo generation, and get this, its damage. This is going to stack up to 10 times with those higher stacks running out more quickly. Similar to how Burning Fist works on Worm Gods. Now, we don't know what the damage buff is going to be, but I can tell you right now, there's not too many weapons that will benefit from this more than Choir of 1. This special auto rifle is arguably one of the best weapons you can get from this past year's content. Matter of fact, we went over the list of weapons we recommend people go for. Choir of 1 was at the top of that list. The damage that it puts out, the fact that it's a special weapon, but it shoots an auto rifle form. But when you shoot from the hip, it quite literally shoots out this burst fire similar to that of a wyvern. And boy, does it do a chunky amount of damage. This volley can outright shred champions. But what makes this build even nastier is when we go full void and also use a void machine gun. Here we have Void Titan with Actium War rig. We've got Choir of 1 and really any void machine gun of your choice, whether it's Commemoration or Corrective Measure, hell, even Hammerhead. Now we're gonna go full weapons and class stats. Now we don't have an archetype for this, as in we don't have something that primarily boosts weapons and the other one boosting our class and that secondary stats, but we do have the ability to roll a primary stat in class and a secondary stat in weapons with the specialist archetype. I think I would still prefer to have as much as I can possibly get in weapons though. You're gonna do everything you can to try to pump up that damage even further. Now here we're gonna be using the Bastion Overshield Barricade and the Controlled Demolition aspect. Essentially with this setup, once you pop down a barricade, you just start drawing all enemy fire to yourself because our barricade now taunts enemies. At the same time, you're gonna be giving yourself overshield. Then with Actium War rig, this is gonna be boosting our damage and ammo regeneration rate of our weapons as we continue to get more kills, whether that's with Choir of 1 or our Void machine gun. And what's so beautiful about this is that you can easily swap between Choir and your Void machine gun. And if you gotta shoot the loot kinetic weapon, you won't even have to leave your spot. Now, if you have the stabilizing rounds on Choir of 1, which I highly advise you use, guys, this is by far the best exotic catalyst on Choir after its update in Heresy. This is going to allow for constant proccing of controlled demolition for that health regeneration on top of more AoE damage to enemies. But this is the beauty of volatile rounds, as you can abuse Choir further by getting a single kill with it, which will proc volatile rounds, but it procs it for your entire character. Now what that means is that you can swap to your Void machine gun, and looky there, you have volatile rounds with your Void machine gun. Guys, I've used this build even in the current sandbox. It is so good, and we're not even taking into account the damage buff from Actium War rig. And what's so beautiful about this is that I'm assuming we're going to be able to get kills with our machine gun, and then you could swap to Choir of 1 with those full stacks and then just volley fire into a champion. To me, fellas, this build right here is going to be the best Titan build next season, even surpassing bulk charge builds. I know we don't have anything really in our artifact mods that are assisting us here outside of the rapid fire mod. You have some artifact mods, of course, that give you some levels of synergy, but nothing on the level of like Solar and Strand and Stasis here. You got Elemental Daze, where stunning a champion with an elemental weapon creates an elemental aligned explosion, applying a matching elemental debuff to them and nearby targets. You got Shoulder to Shoulder for that survivability. And in our final column, for the same reason we chose Elemental Benevolence, we're also going to be choosing Elemental Overdrive. And that's because when we pick up a Void Breach, we're going to be increasing the damage of our weapons that match that element. So between this artifact mod and the damage that we're getting from Actium and just the sheer damage that Choir puts out by itself, this build is going to be bumping. So that's essentially it, fellas. Those are the four Titan builds that I'm really excited about. Again, if you want to rock Stasis, by all means, go right ahead. We have that link down below. But these are the three that I feel like are going to pop off the most. And all three of these are currently saved for myself. And as we get into the new sandbox with different archetypes, we'll probably be updating these dim links, or we might just put out build videos right out the gates. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.